you'll notice that the sermon title is A God Who Hugs. You may wonder what Habakkuk has to do with hugs. But did you know that the name or the word Habakkuk means to embrace or an embracer? You see, Habakkuk is a prophet in the nation of Israel. And in his little book of 56 verses, which I encourage you to go home and read from, the beginning to the end. 56 verses isn't a long time. You'll want to return to it again and again. But in his little book, he reveals to the people God the embracer, God the hugger. If you want to be more theological, God the comforter. And we get this picture of God in the little book of Habakkuk, of a God who, when we are in the midst of uncomfortable times, wraps his arms around hurting, frightened, anxious people in a giant bear hug. Now, it's proven medically that hugging is healthy. I clipped this several years ago, and it still works today. Somebody says hugging is healthy. It helps the body's immunity system. It keeps you healthier. It cures depression. It reduces stress. It induces sleep. It's invigorating. It's rejuvenating. It has no unpleasant side effects. And hugging is nothing less than a miracle drug. Hugging is all natural. It's organic, naturally sweet, no pesticides, no preservatives, no artificial ingredients, and 100% wholesome. Hugging is practically perfect. There are no batteries to wear out, no periodic checkups, low energy consumption, high energy yield, inflation-proof, non-fattening, no monthly payments, no insurance requirements, non-taxable, non-polluting, and of course, fully returnable. Isn't that good? Hugging. I don't know what it is, but there's something about a hug that just makes you feel good. There are times, and you know this, when a handshake just doesn't cut it. Even the spoken words, I care, often aren't as effective as a hug. Who of us, at least once in our life, has not said, I just need a hug? Happens in my home. Kathy comes home after a tough day. I just need a hug, she says. But you know what else she says, but she's really not saying? Bob, don't do the man thing. Please, don't do the man thing. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to fix anything. You don't have to fix me. You don't have to solve my problems or answer my questions or give me advice. And please don't try. It just makes me mad. I just need a hug. As many of you know, I grew up in a family of 12 kids. I was visibly poorer than the rest of the kids in my school. My hand-me-down clothes would have been the first clue. My parents were very religious, so there were a fair number of conduct restrictions, so that a lot of things my friends got to do, I didn't. I was smaller and skinnier than most of my classmates, and so I made up for my smallness by being a bit yappy. There are other. Hard to imagine, isn't it? Isn't that hard to imagine? And so at times, sometimes it was my own fault, sometimes it wasn't. I got teased and picked on and bullied. Sounds a lot like my life at St. Andrews. I'm whining, I know, I'm whining. Yeah. But back then, I'd come running home after some of that treatment, and I'd be mad and crying and frustrated and confused and afraid, and every time my mom would put her arms around me and hug me to her. Now, she didn't have to say a lot. She didn't have a lot to say. There wasn't much she could do to change either my size or our economic situation or the family rules. She'd given up on trying to change my yappiness. She rarely solved my problems or had answers to my questions about why life was like it was. She never once ran out and beat up the boys who were picking on me. But there was something about that hug and the comfort, care, and concern it communicated that reassured me. And I knew that somehow I would be okay. It was amazing how my frustration and my anger would bleed off. That's exactly the picture Habakkuk, whose name means to embrace, paints of God. A God who wraps his arms around angry, frustrated, hurting, afraid, uncertain children of his. And he does for us what my mother did for me. Habakkuk was a prophet in Israel during very difficult days. As we begin to read his little book, he's talking to God. He's asking questions, and we get the idea he's not getting many answers back. I read a devotional this week that was based on the fact that often life is a mystery, and there don't seem sometimes to be a lot of answers to life's difficult, complex problems. Habakkuk reminds me of the little boy who came up to his dad one day and said, "Dad, how many people are there in the world?" And his dad replied, "I don't know, son." A couple of minutes later, he asks, "Dad, how many stars in the sky?" And again, his father says, "I don't know, son." A few minutes later, he's back. "Well, Dad, how many fish are there in the sea?" And again, his father says, "Son, I don't know." Finally, the little boy kind of sheepishly says, "You don't mind me asking you all these questions, do you, Dad?" And his father replies, "No, son, how are you going to learn if you don't ask questions?" Now, Habakkuk's like that little boy. Things weren't going real well in the nation of Israel. In fact, the situation is dreadful. It's a very uncomfortable time to be living in Israel. Josiah, the good king, has been killed in battle. Jehoiakim, the bad king, is on the throne. This is just before the Israelites get carried off into Babylon in captivity. Morally, ethically, spiritually, the nation is a mess and in decline. And if you look at verses 2 to 4 in chapter 1 again, violence goes unpunished. We read these words. Injustice and wrongdoing is tolerated. Destruction and violence are everywhere. Strife and conflict abounds. The law seems paralyzed. Justice never prevails. In other words, there seem to be more rights for the criminal than the victim. The wicked hem in the righteous. Does that sound anything like what we face as we enter 2012? Lots of uncertainty, lots of questions, lots of problems, few answers equals anxiety. This devotional that I read earlier this week, at one point the author writes these words: "Is this the year for markets to collapse, causing my life savings to plummet? Or will a surge of high inflation do much the same damage? Will terrorism continue to spread even to the country in which I live? Who will protect children from sexual predators who seem to be everywhere? And is cyber warfare the next global menace, which could disable the electric grid, the financial infrastructure, or even the minimal functioning of government? All of this makes me wonder again," he writes, "will 2012 be the year? And if so, the year for what?" Habakkuk's little book, 56 verses, is about having to embrace things we don't really want to accept, having to live with less than the ideal, unpleasant things that aren't going away until Jesus returns. And you're thinking right now of something in your life that is less than ideal, yet out of your ability to control. And Habakkuk's message is that we can learn to embrace and accept these things. We can live in uncomfortable times because we have a God of comfort, a God who embraces us, a God who wraps his arms around us and surrounds us with his presence. And our friend Habakkuk helps us to move, this is in your notes, from questions to confidence, from frustration to faith, and from problems to praise. Let me give those to you again. Questions to confidence, frustration to faith, problems to praise. And I want to know how. How do you do that? How do I get from questions to confidence? How do I get from frustration to faith? How do I get from problems to praise? Especially when the problems are still there. Let me quickly walk you through this little book. I'm not going to take a long time to do this, but I want to send you home with 6 words. There's a process that God takes Habakkuk through in this little book. The first word is honesty. If we're going to go from questions about God to confidence in God, we need to be honest. And I love Habakkuk's honesty here. How long, Lord? Must I call for help, but you don't listen? Why do you make me look at all this violence and injustice? Why do you tolerate all this evil? In other words, God, where are you? Are you not listening? Are you there, God? God, do you care? Very relevant questions I hear them almost every week from people in the midst of difficulty. Habakkuk doesn't hold back or sugarcoat his words. Here's a prophet, a religious spokesperson for the nation of Israel, and he doesn't hold back his questions, his frustrations and doubts. He freely and honestly expresses them to God. And you know what? You might as well. God knows what you're feeling and thinking anyway. You can't fool him. You can't pull the wool over his eyes. If you're frustrated or angry or confused or have doubts, he already knows. And did you notice? Habakkuk expresses those feelings to God. Now, I want to say something to you here. Friends are important. Spouses are important. Good friends and spouses we can unload on or vent to. But we often leave God out of the picture. Yet he's the one with all the answers and the real comfort. Some time ago, I read a true story of a Christian grandmother who had raised her children under God as best she knew. But they were struggling. One of her daughters was living out of marriage with a boyfriend, a relationship that had produced 2 children, and one of those children, a 3-year-old little girl, was being abused by this boyfriend father. And this Christian grandmother was put in the position of having to turn in her own children to the authorities. And she writes in anguish and tears, "How can it be? I prayed. I did everything I could. I hammered on the doors of heaven, and everybody knew this was going on. And yet this 3-year-old was abused. Why didn't God answer?" And she adds, "My picture of God is that at this moment he's standing up there in heaven with his hands in his pockets." Ever feel like that? God, where are you? Do you care? Honesty. But then Habakkuk moves from honest questions to patience. In the first part of verse 2, let me read you the words. "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint." Then the Lord replied, "Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false." And then look at these words. "Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay."